My name is George Kimbrell, and I'm the legal director of the nonprofit Center for Food Safety. We're an organization formed in 1997 whose mission is to empower consumers, support family farmers, and protect the earth from the harmful impacts of industrial agriculture. We have over 1 million members across the country, and our program areas cover everything throughout the food system from farm to fork. We've always had a flagship program on truth in labeling, that is, the public's right to know what's in their food and what they feed their families. As legal director, I oversee all of our litigation, policy work, and legislative work, as well as direct a team of 7 other public interest attorneys. My own litigation has spanned the gamut of all our program areas and addressed everything in the industrial agriculture sector, from factory farm pollution of water systems, to pesticides' impacts on endangered species, to aquaculture and its impacts on our oceans, to truth in labeling, greenwashing, and making sure that our labels have integrity. I've also written several state ballot initiatives on food labeling issues. And finally, I teach as an adjunct professor at Lewis and Clark Law School, where since 2010 I've taught food and agriculture law, including the law of food labeling. Now, I have 2 goals for this talk. First, I'm going to be your guide through the dizzying maze of food labels, and in particular, animal food labels. We're going to talk about the history and how we got here. We're going to talk about the problems, the inconsistencies, the lack of transparency or cohesion. We're going to talk about the role of the federal government and the role of the state governments and state litigation. We're going to talk about the various laws in question, and we're also going to talk about some court cases. Then second, I'm going to take you right to the present. I'm going to tell you a few stories, a few 21st century examples of food labeling controversies, including ways that you can be involved. As we go, I want you to keep a few questions in mind. First, why do we label? To what ends? Is it just to sell more products? To increase marketability? Is it for personal interest, to inform that particular individual consumer? Is it a form of accountability, a form of regulation of the producer of the good? Or should it not be voluntary? Do we have a right to know what's in our food? Second, what do we label? Is it just to ensure that labels are not false and misleading, that they're not deceiving us? Or is it about health, nutrition, allergies, food safety? Or is it about the broader process, how the food is made, and the impacts on animal welfare, on the environment, on workers, on social justice issues? Third, who and how do we label? That is, does the market handle the labeling, or is it a government function? And if the government requires it, at what level, the federal or the state? And how are those labels presented to us? Is it text on a package, a display sign in a store, a symbol, or, as may be more common in the 21st century to come, is it going to be something that we scan with our phone? And the answer is all of the above, because food labeling is not static. It's a social construct that reflects its time, and as the public's appetite for labels has grown, so have what we label and why we label, which should give us hope for further future improvements in this area. The U.S. system of food regulation, and thus food labeling regulation, can best be described as dizzying and byzantine. You're talking about 15 different agencies and sub-agencies all involved in different aspects of our food labeling system. They all have different legal authorities. In fact, up to 30 laws are involved, all with different implementing regulations, all covering different label types. Now, how and why did we get here? The reason is our history of food labeling is a history of waves, making layers one on top of another. 115 years of layers, in fact, going all the way back to the turn of the last century, 1906. New laws would follow public demand or scientific advancement, or both. But there was no effort to harmonize or centralize those laws in one agency or one law. And the result created a system that is uneven, inefficient, filled with loopholes, with a lack of transparency or cohesion. It's difficult for an expert to figure out, let alone a shopper in a store. Let me give you the classic example. Frozen pizzas. You've got 2 frozen pizzas. One is cheese, one is pepperoni. They're exactly the same except for a few slices of pepperoni on one of them. Otherwise, the same ingredients, same manufacturer. And yet those 2 products go through 2 different agencies. They go through different inspection points. They go through a different legal standard and they have different labels. Crazy, right? So how did we get here? Let's start at the beginning. Federal regulation of our food safety and thus food labeling began in 1906. Why then? Well, food safety was part of the broader progressive movement at the time. Now, food contamination at that time was running rampant. You had milk being adulterated with chalk to give it a white color and formaldehyde to keep it from rotting. You had honey products that were actually just completely made of corn syrup. There were no consequences for food contamination and no consequences for false labeling. Now, 3 individuals were primarily responsible for the ultimate passage of our first 2 food safety and food labeling laws. First, you have Upton Sinclair, who of course wrote The Jungle, the excoriating expose of the U.S. meat industry, and in particular meatpacking conditions in the Chicago slaughterhouses. Now, Sinclair's focus was on workers and their rights and the inhumane conditions to workers at the time in that industry. But he also included a chapter in his book on the food that he found there, the contaminated, rotting, diseased beef in those facilities. And that was the chapter that caused the public uproar. As Sinclair himself said, he aimed for America's heart, but he hit their stomach. And he found a champion in the president at the time, Teddy Roosevelt, the anti-monopoly trust buster, and who had experienced himself the problems of the U.S. food system when years before, in 1898, in the Spanish-American War, he and his Rough Riders had gotten rotten food from their own provisions, food so bad that it caused his men to fall ill and many died. So he was ready to champion reform of the food system. And finally, you had Dr. Harvey Wiley, a chemist with the U.S. Department of Agriculture at the time, who was so fed up with the adulteration in the food system that he went to the extreme measure of testing food products that he believed to be dangerous and contaminated or adulterated using volunteers, young clerks, anonymous clerks from the Department of Agriculture that came to be known as the Poison Squad. They came to great acclaim, front page articles in the Washington Post and other papers about them. So the efforts of these individuals together brought us our first food safety and food labeling laws, the Federal Meat Inspection Act of 1906 and the Pure Food Act, also known as the Wiley Act of 1906. But that wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. And in the decades that have followed, many more waves of food regulation and food labeling have layered upon those initial statutes. Just to give a few examples, in 1938, the Pure Food Act was replaced by the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which expanded on its food safety provisions as well as created the Food and Drug Administration. In the 1940s, the public interest was about marketing and voluntary standards for food grading, and so Congress created the Agricultural Marketing Agency to do that. By the 50s, you had consolidation in the poultry industry like that in the beef industry, and so a sister statute was passed, the Poultry Products Inspection Act, that mirrored the Federal Meat Inspection Act in 1957. You also had thousands of new chemical additives being put into our food then, and so the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was amended with the Food Additives Act in 1958. In the 60s, there was interest in the packaging and regulating it beyond just the label, and the Fair Packaging Act followed. And when we started to make egg products out of shell eggs, like liquid eggs or powdered eggs, you had a new statute to cover that, the Egg Products Inspection Act of 1970. In the decades leading to 1990, you saw the rise of unsubstantiated health claims on food, as well as nutrition science and the public interest in the nutritional content of food. So in 1990, for the first time, Congress mandated the labeling of nutrition information in the Nutrition Labeling Education Act. You also saw, at that time, the culmination of several decades of the environmental movement and organic farming as part of the environmental movement, as an offset, as an alternative to the industrial agriculture system. And so in 1990, Congress passed the Organic Food Production Act and created the organic label. Finally, in 2004, we got the Allergy Labeling Act, which requires the mandatory disclosure of major food allergens. Those are just some examples. There are many more, but they illustrate the different types of labeling and reasons for labeling that we have. Now, as I mentioned, there are 15 different agencies or sub-agencies involved, but to cut to the quick, here's the basic overview. There are 2 main agencies in charge of most of the food labeling in our system. First, you have the U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA. Now, they cover about 20% of the food market, but it's most of the meat. It's beef, pork, and poultry, and egg products. Then you have FDA. That's 80%, pretty much all the rest, including a lot of meat products like dairy, seafood, cheese, milk, as well as all the processed foods. Now, there are some similarities and some differences. As to the similarities, both USDA and FDA have the basic core standard that's the same as far as prohibiting labels from being false or misleading. Now, labels can't be false or misleading either expressly or by omission. That is, what they have or what they leave out. That's in both of the meat statutes that USDA implements, the Federal Meat Inspection Act and the Poultry Products Inspection Act, as well as FDA's major statute, the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Now, there's one major difference between them, which is that USDA has to approve labels before they are allowed on products in the market. Before you put a meat label on a product, USDA has to approve it, whereas for FDA-regulated products, that's not required. FDA only enforces misleading labels after the fact through enforcement actions on manufacturers. Now, the USDA label process can be for an individual label or a generic one that they've already approved that you wanted to use on your product. And USDA includes not just basic required standards of labeling like the name, the standard identity, nutritional content, ingredients, but also process claims like cage-free or grass-fed. Whereas FDA includes all of the mandatory categories I mentioned, but not process claim approval. These differences have big implications for the state role in food labeling, as we'll discuss later. Two other agencies I'll mention briefly. The Federal Trade Commission, they cover the advertising part of this. So that's everything beyond the label, social media, the internet, print, TV. And their mandate is very similar to the other agencies. That is, at its core, to counteract and protect against deceptive trade practices, including false and misleading food advertising. And the Agricultural Marketing Service, which covers voluntary labeling. This is a sub-agency of USDA, and they cover things like market quality grading, or the organic certification standard, or the kosher standard. Now, I want to end with some bizarre product splits between the agencies to show the inefficiencies in the way we do this. So I mentioned the frozen pizza example. Now, that's one particular example of a larger category, the category being processed foods that have some amount of meat in them. Other examples would be canned chili or canned soup, chicken noodle soup, beef and barley soup. And which agency oversees that product depends on the amount of meat in it and the ratio of the meat to the other ingredients in the product. Over a certain amount, it goes through USDA's process. Under a certain amount, FDA. Some other examples. I mentioned USDA is the meat agency and they oversee most of the meat products. That's mostly true, except FDA has its own meats. They call them exotic meats. So this would be everything like deer, elk, pheasant. Those go through FDA's process. I also mentioned that seafood goes through FDA. Again, mostly true, but there's an exception. In the 2000s, the catfish lobby lobbied Congress to amend the Farm Bill to include catfish under their jurisdiction. So catfish is labeled and regulated by USDA, unlike the rest of seafood. Another crazy example is eggs. We have shell egg regulation and labeling, which is done by FDA. But when it comes to egg products, that's liquid or powdered eggs, that goes through USDA's process. And finally, produce. If it's raw, it's going through USDA, but once it becomes a processed good like apples to apple juice or apples to apple sauce, it's FDA's problem. So in conclusion, this system has led, understandably, to repeated reform calls and advocating for a unified system with one agency, one legal standard to help us create better food safety standards and better labeling, more transparent labeling, and perhaps most importantly, labeling that includes what people care about on labels in the 21st century. Now let's talk about the state's role in the system. We have a long history in our democracy of the states as the labs of our democracy. When we have a failure to lead in Washington, D.C., states often lead the way. They fill the gaps, and then their example sometimes moves over to the federal level. Now, importantly, the state role can take two forms, and we're going to talk about both. First, you have state laws that are enacted, other laws to supplement the federal laws. But you also have litigation based on state causes of action. That is, the regulation of food labels through state consumer protection laws. These are state laws that are intended to prevent deceptive trade and false and misleading labels. So it's a way of supplementing the federal agency oversight. If a false and misleading label is out there and a federal agency isn't acting on it, cases using these state causes of action can really get at the problem. And this is where a lot of the action is, because the agricultural lobby is so powerful in many states you can't enact laws, so litigation is where you can really effectuate change. However, there are limits, in particular the constitutional doctrine of preemption. Now, preemption stems from the supremacy clause of the Constitution, which basically says that when you have a federal law and a state law and they collide, the state law must give way. Now, there are three types of preemption to know about. First, there's express, which is exactly what it sounds like. A federal law says in it that there can be no state law that can operate in this space. But you can also have different types of implied preemption, where a statute doesn't actually say so, but it still has preemptive effect. For example, field preemption. This is where the federal regime is so comprehensive in a particular area that there's no room really for the states to operate. And then you can have conflict preemption. So in that case, the federal law and the state law have a conflicting mandate, and it's either impossible to comply with both, or the state law presents an obstacle to complying with the federal goals. Now, let's apply it in the food labeling context. And when you do, you'll see that it's a mixed bag, depending on the context. First, let's talk about FDA-regulated food labeling. Now remember, that's 80% of food labeling. That's some meats, including seafood, dairy, cheese, and eggs. Now on the FDA side, there's no express preemption in their underlying statute. So that's good for rooms for state to operate. You don't have a preemption provision until 1990, when Congress passes the Nutrition Act. But even then, Congress limited the preemption to only certain categories of label information. For those categories, states can't require anything different, nor could cases be brought challenging those categories as false and misleading. So some of those categories are things like nutrition information, the standard of identity for the product, the ingredients list, its common name. But again, these are listed in the statute. As a result, states have ample room to operate, and there's no preemption beyond those very few categories. So if states want to pass a law, or if cases want to be brought about false and misleading labeling beyond those selected categories, the label's fair game. The result has been an explosion of false and misleading food labeling cases in the last decade. They've gone from less than 50 in 2010 to over 220 this past year, 2021. The class action bar even has a name for it, the food court, it's called, and it's one of the fastest growing areas in litigation. There are a lot of examples. One of the most prominent is the natural litigation. So this is products out there on the market. You've seen them that say all natural, made with 100% natural ingredients, or naturally produced. And yet these products oftentimes are made with high fructose corn syrup or synthetic ingredients, artificial ingredients, or include pesticide residues, or were produced using genetically engineered ingredients. Because FDA has never defined what natural is, and it's not an area covered by the preemption provision in its statute, it's fair game. The question becomes, what would a reasonable consumer think natural means in that context? And a lot of these cases have been really successful. The first such case was against Snapple for their drinks, where they claimed that they were 100% natural. You remember these ads on TV, the greatest stuff on earth. And since then, there have been other cases about pretty much any kind of product out there under FDA's jurisdiction. Sodas, oils, chips, granola bars, you name it. Now, on the USDA side, and remember this is 20% of all food labeling, but most of the meat and poultry. On the USDA side, unlike the FDA law, the meat laws do have an express preemption provision. And it states that you can't have a state label imposed that is, quote, in addition or different than what USDA has approved. So that's a problem for state action in this area with regards to these products. Now, there are a couple silver linings. First, USDA has to pre-approve that label before it goes out onto the market. But unfortunately, in practice, that's cold comfort because USDA standards for some of those labels, particularly the process based ones, are too low for advocates and tough to believe in. For example, cage free, which literally just means that a bird isn't kept in the cage for its entire life. And they're tough to move once USDA sets them. And USDA doesn't even go on farms to inspect whether they're really being followed. They just review documents submitted to them during the label approval process. The second silver lining is a little bit better, and that one is that the preemption is limited only to the label itself, not the surrounding advertising for that product. So cases can go against anything in social media, against print ads, anything on TV. The only thing that can't be remedied is a label if USDA has approved it. And relatedly, the third silver lining is that the preemptive scope beyond what USDA has approved on the label is a little bit unclear. So let's say, for example, they don't have a standard for humanely raised. Could a case be brought against a claim of humanely raised, or could a state enact a law that established a standard for humanely raised? It seems that they could, given that USDA hasn't already preempted the field. So just like on the FDA side, you've seen a proliferation in recent years of cases against meat ads as false and misleading. I'll give a few examples. There has been a recently successful case against the Hormel company for its deli meat campaign, where the label says it's a natural choice. And that's a label that USDA has approved, so the label itself can't be remedied, but they also have an entire advertising campaign around it, print and video ads, and those have been successfully challenged. Now compare that to the Snapple case. In the Snapple case, they could successfully challenge the label because it's an FDA product, but with Hormel, they can't, just the ads around it. Also, there are cases against Cargill Turkey for its claims that its turkey products come from independent family farmers, even though these are contract farmers in a vertically integrated industry that have zero say in how the birds are produced, don't even owe them, with every step of their production dictated from Cargill. And similarly, Tyson, which claims that it has humane production for its chickens, even though those chickens are produced in confined animal feeding operations, or that it has safe work environments for its workers, even though those workers were some of the most harmed by COVID during the pandemic. So again, on the USDA side, a little bit different. Some parts of the label can be challenged. Definitely the advertising can be challenged, but not if the label has been approved and certified by USDA. So in conclusion, state litigation or legislation can be an effective tool to hold companies accountable. And again, state laws can be the labs for our democracy as they have in the past and move us towards an improved label using grassroots power at the state and local level for change. All right, now that we are through that maze, on to the fun part, the stories. These are microcosms of the underlying themes of how and why we label, and how that shifts over time, and what the hidden drivers are. So our first example is organic food labeling. Now, this story is particularly important for those of you that care about animal welfare, because that's the lens we're going to talk about the organic standards. So as we discussed, the first federal law that required the labeling and certification of organic food was passed in 1990, the Organic Food Production Act. And the U.S. Department of Agriculture oversees that certification standard. But the history of organic goes back much further than that, decades, to the history of the environmental movement. After World War II, we started putting these wartime chemicals, these synthetic pesticides and fertilizers, into our food system and making it more and more industrialized. And as a reaction to that, Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, which was about the harm that pesticide spraying was having on biodiversity and in particular birds. Because of that, you saw the passage of all of our flagship environmental laws, the National Environmental Policy Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act in the early 70s. And you saw the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. And organic farming was a part of that movement, with people going back to the land and saying, you know what, I want to do it the right way. I want to grow food and raise animals in a holistic, regenerative way, not in this industrial way. And so it was very much tied to that movement. Now, since there wasn't any federal standard that was set, the lead was taken by the states as the laboratories of our democracy. And in fact, Oregon in 1972 had the first organic certification label for organic farming. It was followed by California, and by 1990, you had 22 different states, all with their own organic food labels. At the same time, organic was the fastest growing sector in the agricultural economy and quickly becoming big business. So Congress stepped in 1990 and it passed the Organic Food Production Act. And that law preempted the state laws and set a new federal standard for market consistency for these products. But it also established an inherent tension that still exists between a market-based system and the holistic underlying farming principles of sustainable farming that organic was based on. So OFPA had some things it was very clear about, in particular on the crop side. It said, for example, you couldn't farm using pesticides or using genetically engineered crops. It said when you were farming, you had to do soil benefiting activities. It was a process-based system that you got certified for. So it was really looking at the broader aspects of your agriculture and your impacts on the land on which you were farming. But while it was detailed on the crop side, it was less so on the organic livestock side. And in fact, the 2000 rules, which were the first implementing rules of the law, really just said that organic livestock had to have, quote, access to pasture, but didn't really define what access meant. So, of course, corporations wanting to take advantage of the market premium of organic and the label tried to cut corners. There was a dairy in Colorado, Aurora Dairy, that was labeling its milk as organic milk, even though it was a confined animal feeding operation, a feedlot with its dairy cattle crowded with no pasture at all. And a watchdog nonprofit exposed this. That eventually led to class action litigation and eventually a new rule, the pasture rule, in 2010, which for the first time defined what access to pasture meant for organic livestock. And it said that they had to have access to that pasture year-round, and in fact had to be pastured on it at least 120 days and get at least 30% of their intake feed from it. But the rule only applied to dairy cows, not other organic livestock like chickens, turkeys, or beef cattle. So a different rule was put into the works, and it was 10 years in the making, the Organic Livestock and Poultry Practices Rule, and it was issued in January of 2017 for all organic livestock. And for the first time, the rules really fleshed out the intent of the law with regards to things like animal care and animal welfare. It said, for example, that organic livestock's natural behaviors had to be accounted for. It prohibited things like physical alterations, tail docking, or beak clipping of those animals. It really limited the stocking density of those animals, and it closed loopholes like the idea that you could have a concrete porch and that would be sufficient outdoor access for chickens rather than actually letting them henpeck in the dirt. The 2017 Animal Welfare Rule was a huge step forward and very important in aligning consumers' reasonable expectations of what that label means and why they pay more for it with the reality of what it is. However, unfortunately, in early 2018, with the change in administrations, the Trump administration froze that rule and then subsequently withdrew that rule. When they did, they issued a new legal interpretation, a dangerous one, for the first time arguing that organic has nothing to do with animal welfare. And instead, it's just about limiting chemicals in agriculture. But when it comes to animal care or animal welfare, all of that isn't encompassed by what the law can cover and therefore can't be accounted for in the label. Now, of course, this is an existential threat to organic as a meaningful label for any animal products. Most consumers buy organic products with the assumption that the animals are well cared for and raised in a humane way. And if it's not going to mean that, then it's going to be a label without integrity for all of those products. So my organization, on behalf of a coalition of others, brought a lawsuit early in 2018 challenging this withdrawal decision. And that case is still ongoing, proceeding through the courts as we speak. In the meantime, the Biden administration, early in 2021, has come into office and said that they're going to reconsider the withdrawal rule. Now, we don't know yet exactly what that means, other than it's possible that they could reissue the original Obama administration rule that does provide for organic welfare and organic, or something different. So there's a lot that's uncertain, and it's a critical juncture in this battle for integrity and the standard, making it a perfect time for advocates to speak loudly to the current administration about having an organic label with integrity. I would end with a few big picture points. Number one, Organic labeling is a process-based labeling. So remember at the beginning when we were talking about what matters for purposes of labeling, it's one of the few mandatory labels we have that talks about those broader processes. What are the impacts to the environment or to animal welfare from the way we produce food? And so as such, it's a really important example for future process-based labeling, requirements of labeling. Number two, it's the first time that we have, again, a mandatory label in our society where we said enough. We don't want this technocratic, industrialized agriculture food. We're actually going to try to choose something different here with this label, give us a choice. And so again, it represents this alternative paradigm to build on for the future. And finally, as I alluded to, throughout its history, and now as this story illustrates, there is a battle for the soul of this standard and whether it's going to have integrity or not. Organic is big business now. It's everywhere. It's in Walmart. And that's good on the one hand, but on the other hand, it means that corporations are always looking to undercut its integrity and find loopholes. And advocates have to try to protect its integrity so it retains that meaning. This next story is about another question we ask. Where did a food come from? Country of origin labeling. The more globalized the food industry becomes, the more relevant country of origin labeling seems. There might be a number of reasons why consumers might want to know the country of origin of a food. Maybe it's a patriotic rationale or a jingoistic rationale or a market advantage rationale. You want to buy American. Or maybe it's a food safety right to know rationale. You have concerns about the safety of a particular country's food practices. Or maybe it's an environmental rationale. That is the carbon footprint of travel from a certain country. It's an organic apple, but it came all the way from New Zealand. Or is it something specific to the location conditions of a particular place? Maybe it's the conditions of how they treat their workers, or maybe it's the animal welfare of a particular place, or the environmental impacts of the production there. Think a depleted fishery, like shrimp farming in Southeast Asia, where they destroy the mangroves off the coast in order to farm the shrimp. So the history of country of origin labeling or COOL labeling goes back to the last century and the Tariff Act of 1930. But importantly, food products were exempted. So that's why we have country of origin labeling for lots of other goods. But we didn't have food country of origin labeling until this century in the 2002 and 2008 Farm Bills. Congress assigned the duty of the rulemaking for this to USDA. And the statute requires that retailers provide this information to consumers at the point of sale. So you'll see it on product packages or near them in display cases. It's a text statement that says grown in Mexico or buy in the U.S., usually a simple clause of that nature, product of the U.S. And it lists out what commodities are covered by it. There are 8 different categories: frozen and fresh fruit and vegetables, chicken, lamb, goat, seafood, that's fish and shellfish, nuts, and honey among them. It doesn't cover processed food products, and it doesn't cover restaurants or other places, so you're mostly going to see it in the grocery store. And it doesn't cover beef or pork, but as it initially was passed by Congress, it did. And the story of why it doesn't cover beef and pork anymore is the country of origin meat labeling controversy. And it's a story of industrial meat, big ag exceptionalism, and it pits small family farmers against the industrial agriculture system. In the first rules in 2009 that USDA issued, it allowed 2 different labels on beef for country of origin. One, if the cow was born and bred and slaughtered in the U.S., that would say U.S. origin, and one, if it had been born and raised and slaughtered in different countries, which would say commingling and then list all those countries. Mexico and Canada brought a World Trade Organization challenge that this was discriminatory against them. And USDA stepped back and issued a second attempt in 2013 to do a rule for country of origin labeling, which in this one would list the countries step by step. So if a cow was born in one country and raised in another and slaughtered in a third, as oftentimes is the case in our industrial agriculture system, then the label would have to identify each of those countries for their step respectfully. Unfortunately, the WTO again agreed with Canada and Mexico that having this label and separating it from the U.S. origin label would be discriminatory against their products. And as such, it levied a $1 billion retaliatory tariff against the U.S. if the U.S. would continue on with this labeling. Instead of paying that, in 2015, Congress repealed COOL labeling, country of origin labeling for beef and pork. So what's the future? Well, several states, North Dakota, Wyoming among them, ranching states, have introduced a state label that would identify beef from U.S. sources. Because currently you can have a product of the USA label on beef, on ground beef, for example, even if it's just processed in the U.S. This would require that the animal live its entire life in the U.S. to have that label. And in addition to that, the Biden administration has promised a new federal rule that would define product of the U.S. for beef products. So we'll see. There's a number of things up in the air with the future of COOL labeling for beef and pork products. I would offer 2 points to close. First, a critique. How useful is this labeling to the consumer really in the marketplace? It's a fairly indirect way of providing information that might be useful. It requires you to really know something else about a particular location in order for it to really have meaning. On the other hand, it's an example of a label that is helping local farmers compete against multinational corporations, providing an alternative paradigm against the current multinational industrial agriculture paradigm, and potentially offers a future local food systems-based, process-based label example. So in these ways, country of origin labeling could be a great example for future process-based labeling in the 21st century. A third example of 21st century food labeling issues is the controversy over genetically engineered food and their labeling. Now, this is an example of process and whether we label for process, the process of genetic engineering, and why we label. Do we label for environmental impacts of that process or health unknowns about it or ethical concerns about it? And how we do the labeling. Is the labeling on the package text or is it something else like a QR code scan? But really, views about genetic engineering and genetically engineered organisms in the food system represent two opposite views of what the food system should be. On the one hand, proponents of genetically engineered crops, they view the food system as one that should be as commodified and industrialized and engineered as possible in order to be as efficient as possible and best fit our industrial agriculture model. That's why we have genetically engineered crops that are resistant to pesticides right now as what the commercial reality is of that model. We can spray more pesticides, we can grow crops in monocultures, and we externalize the cost of the environment of that activity. We don't have genetically engineered animals yet. They're in research and development, but when we do get them, they will similarly try to fit them better into the confined animal feeding operation model. So you'll have genetically engineered pigs and cows and chickens that would, for example, be desensitized to pain or deal with confinement better. That's their view of what agriculture should look like. Of course, there's a very different view, an older view, the original view, which is that we should grow food in a holistic way, in a sustainable, regenerative way that is at peace and actually learns from natural processes. So the labeling fight is just a proxy war between those two philosophies for what the future of our food should look like. So let's back up. Why don't we have genetically engineered food labeling in our country already? 64 countries around the world do, including all of the European Union, Japan, China, Russia, Brazil. The reason is because in 1992, FDA made a policy decision that genetically engineered foods weren't, quote, material for purposes of labeling. And that meant that there wouldn't be any pre-market safety review of them before they were put into food. And it meant that there wouldn't be requirement of any disclosure on a food label of them. So this created quite a controversy as well as some litigation and led to a grassroots effort to get disclosure, to have our right to know about genetically engineered food. You had absence labeling proliferate in the marketplace. That's the non-GMO claim you see on a lot of products not produced through genetic engineering. But you also had efforts to get state laws passed in lieu of a federal law, including ballot initiatives that I co-authored in 2012, 13, and 14 in California, Washington, and Oregon that would have, for the first time, required the labeling of genetically engineered food. All of these ballot initiatives were defeated very narrowly, 51 to 49 in two cases, and in one case, Oregon, by 837 votes total, which is the closest election in Oregon history. The reason they were defeated is because big agriculture spent over $100 million combined in those ballot initiative fights, crushing the spending record in all 3 states to do so. Those losses were tough to take, but in losing, we actually won because bills based on those ballot initiatives were moving in state legislatures in 33 states across the country. And in fact, 3 states, Vermont, Maine, and Connecticut, passed the first ever state laws requiring the labeling of genetically engineered food. The Grocery Manufacturers Association and other food entities challenged that law on commercial speech grounds and on preemption grounds, among others, but we, as well as the state of Vermont, successfully defended it. Having lost in court, the food manufacturers turned to Congress. And in 2016, they found a more ready recipient for their arguments with the passage of the first ever federal labeling law for genetically engineered foods. It's called the Bioengineered Food Disclosure Act. Now, in some ways, it was a great victory, the culmination of 25 years of work on this issue, because it did set in the U.S. a genetically engineered food disclosure standard. But in other ways, it was very much a compromise and didn't live up to the principles or the high standards set by the earlier state laws. As always, the devil was in the details. So let's talk through some of those details and why the law is controversial and why it's currently in litigation. First, the terminology, bioengineered versus genetically engineered. For 25 years, everyone in the space has used either genetically engineered or genetically modified to talk about these products. Yet now, we have a new term, bioengineered, which no one is familiar with. And so to that end, the label really isn't doing the job of what it's supposed to, which is informing consumers about the topic. So one of the challenges in the case we currently have challenging the rules is that that's false and misleading to consumers, and that USDA should have allowed the use of those older terms. There's also the form of the labeling. Instead of clear on-package text, in many cases, manufacturers are going to be allowed to have this disclosure come from smartphone scans called electronic disclosures. Congress recognized how unprecedented this type of labeling was, and as such, required USDA to do a study on how effective it would be. And USDA's own study showed that it would discriminate against large segments of the population, those that didn't have broadband in their grocery store, like in rural areas, or segments of the population that don't have smartphones, poor people, elderly people, minorities. Yet USDA went ahead anyway, despite their own study, and approved that form of labeling for the first time. There are also big problems in the scope of the law. It doesn't include one of the major uses of genetically engineered crops, which is as feed to prop up the confined animal factory model. The monoculture crops we grow, the corn, overwhelmingly doesn't go to feed humans. It goes to feed these animals kept in confinement, and without which they wouldn't be able to continue that model as well. It also doesn't cover highly processed foods like oils and sodas if you can't detect the genetically engineered ingredients in the final product. And finally, it doesn't allow states to do any better than the federal standard, that is, provide more information. And it doesn't allow stores to do any better than the federal standard. So if you're a co-op or you're Whole Foods and you want to provide more information to your shoppers, you're not allowed to do so. So in the litigation, we represent both nonprofits as well as grocers in challenging the law in all the ways that I just discussed, as well as a few more. A few notes on genetically engineered animals and food labeling specifically. If and when we get more genetically engineered animals in the food system, they would be covered by this law. And for the reasons I mentioned, some of those are in research and development to better fit and better further the industrial agriculture model. The only one that we have is the genetically engineered salmon that was approved in 2015 and immediately challenged in a different case and was struck down in 2020 as unlawfully approved. But in the future, we will have livestock, the industry says, that would better fit the industrial agricultural model, and they would be covered under this law as far as their disclosure. However, again, the current system would be left out as far as the animals that are fed genetically engineered corn in the CAFO system. So a few themes to close. Number one, again, process matters. This, like organic, is a really important example for labeling for the impacts of the process of production. Number two, the disclosure how matters. This is a battle for the package. And if manufacturers succeed in getting away with smartphone scanning for this mandatory information, what's next? So they want to be able to use the whole of the package just for advertising instead of government mandated information. And this is a battle that we will see going forward in the 21st century. It's a clarion call to consumers and to public interest advocates to demand clear on-package text labeling for bioengineered food and generally for our food labeling system. This last story is not about a new food label. It's about a change in the law that affects all possible future labeling. Even if governments require labels, corporations are fighting back, and increasingly they're using the First Amendment. The rise and the weaponization of the First Amendment and commercial speech to stop governments from disclosing impacts and disclosing risks of food products. Now, the First Amendment of the Constitution says that government shall not abridge the freedom of our speech. But it's more complicated than that. Not all speech is protected. Traditionally, only select narrow categories of speech warranted high levels of protection. And those would be things you would recognize. The right to speak about your religion, your political views, your ideological views. When speech is protected, governments have a very high burden if they want to regulate it. That's called strict scrutiny. In contrast, commercial speech was never protected under the First Amendment historically. It's not the same caliber, the same type of speech. Think about it. We're talking about a product label. We're talking about a financial transaction and the details of a particular product in the marketplace. That started to change in the 70s a little bit. There was, for the first time, some constitutional protection for commercial speech. But importantly, even then, any constitutional value assigned to it was really for the purchaser. It was called listeners' rights, and it wasn't about the corporate speaker necessarily. So now, in the courts, there's already some protection for commercial speech called intermediate scrutiny. For example, if a state wants to have a label about humanely raised, or it wants to put a warning on soda that it's linked to obesity, a government has to show multiple factors if that label, that disclosure, is challenged in court. It would have to show that there's a substantial government interest in having that information disclosed and that the label itself directly furthers that government interest and that the label is narrowly tailored or not broader than it needs to be. But now, the Supreme Court is further blurring the lines between commercial speech and other protected speech and moving commercial speech more towards an equal status with more traditional protected speech. And this is part of a broader effort to elevate the rights of corporations. You see this in cases like Citizens United, another speech case having to do with restrictions on financial campaign contributions that were struck down by the Supreme Court. So this protection of commercial speech and its weaponization by corporations when governments do pass disclosure laws and labeling laws is another part of the 21st century battle for the labels. To correct that, as always, elections matter and judges matter, and we need to work hard to appoint judges that put people ahead of corporations. How we eat is the most direct environmental and animal welfare decision we make every day. And food labels, what we label, how we label it, and what we omit from labels or allow to be misrepresented on labels are the major legal driver of that decision. Deceptive labels mislead consumers, but they also facilitate arguably the greatest moral failing of our generation: billions of livestock animals in unspeakable, inhumane conditions. And they harm the livelihoods of those farmers trying to practice humane husbandry. So pay attention to your labels. Know your food sources. Buy consciously. Eat consciously. Know and apply history. See labels as the drivers of change, because shifting the social consciousness is how we will build a better food future and a more robust animal law. For the Brooks Institute, I'm George Kimbrell.